Welcome to another Tuesday with Tim, an evening where we can be together in community and sharing in music which we love. Tonight's a unique presentation. It's a preview of this coming weekend's concert with the Wayne Oratorio Society Orchestra, and it'll be featuring orchestra music of Mozart, Bizet as arranged by Shishedrin, and also Barber. And it's going to be a live performance, which is a first for us. And so it'll be streamed live on Saturday night at 7:30 via YouTube. And that link will end up in the description here, as well as you'll receive it in email. Now, one of the questions is, why are we performing this concert? From my perspective, it's how do we keep bringing beauty and music, art, positive energy into the world, especially during this time. And it seemed like a safe way in which we could gather. And it also gives us the opportunity and a medium to go in a direction we normally wouldn't go. Part of that is, frankly, to support my musical colleagues, many of whom have not been playing, which is their livelihood, since March. And so this is an opportunity for us to support those gig workers. All of the players who are playing this weekend have performed in some capacity with us previously. And so it felt like a way to encourage that community. It also felt like a chance to explore repertoire that we wouldn't have done otherwise. And so there's a very unique work on the program for this weekend. So I just hope that tonight I can give some insights into the scores that we'll be playing and talk to you a little bit about the composers and the music and just increase your enjoyment of this weekend's presentation. So the concert's going to actually open with a work by Mozart. Now, we know Mozart. Born in 1756 in Salzburg. And the particular work that we're playing, his Divertimento, he composed when he was 16 years old. He had just returned home to Salzburg after a tour in Italy. And he was already quite a celebrity for his time. He was a child prodigy. His father actually took him out to perform piano, violin. He would improvise and astonish folks with what he could do with his musical genius. And so he's returning to the area after this tour in Italy for a moment just to take a break from the rigors of that. And there's some speculation that he did what he always did, which is he just started composing. Now, while in Italy, he was performing in the courts and giving concerts. He was also meeting composers such as Haydn, Johann Christian Bach. And so he was very aware of what was the cosmopolitan trends of the time. Now, he also came home with what's called a scrittura. This is a contract to compose an opera. And it is from the Opera House in Milan. It was for their following season, which ultimately became Lucio Silla. So he was to begin to work on this new opera. And he also, again, to blow off steam, started to sketch new instrumental compositions. This was to create a baseline of ideas that he could evolve however he wanted, whether it was into string quartets, chamber symphonies, or even add woodwinds for a full sinfonia, for grander functions. Now, Mozart didn't actually name this work himself. Again, he sketched it, but he composed it in the Italian style for string quartet and sinfonia. He had met Johann Christian Bach in London, who was a great influence on him. But in the Italian style, it really was about two solo violins. There was very much a school both for singing as well as virtuoso violinists. And so in this particular work, he's showing off those two voice parts working against each other, almost competing. So the actual style of the work it's set in 3 movements: fast, slow, and fast. Now, the title that was given to it, Divertimento, that just means light entertainment music, somewhat informal, unlike, the heavier terms like sonata or concerto or symphony. So again, that comes across in the style of the music that you'll hear. So the opening movement of the score features Allegro, and it's just a bright opening theme. It's vibrant, and it moves on later to contrast. But at the very beginning, it just starts with a very simple. But But then meanwhile, under it, he puts his classical style to it. And continues on with that bright color that we just identify with Mozart. Great vitality, great energy. Now, the part that's interesting is you only get in about 10 measures, and suddenly the second violin is featured, where after this sort of fanfare start, you know, it very much has a trumpet-esque kind of feel as he's rolling these chords. You know, later on, the second violin then comes in and basically is putting down the challenge to say, I can play just as well as you. And you hear in the second violins, but of course, the first violin has to answer and work off of that, and Mozart develops that theme and also increases the rhythm as he goes through it. So that leads us all through the first opening section, which then gets repeated. He then comes back to that material in the second section, and this is where he develops it a little bit differently, where he starts moving into a different key area just for color purposes. So all of a sudden we're off in a minor land for a moment. And this really foreshadows where he's taking us there, where he gives a really difficult part to the second violins. And this is where he goes off. You know, we started out in this bright D major. And suddenly now we're in D minor. And he's going through this section where it's just rumbling, you know, in the second violin part, but meanwhile above it then, you just get the plaintive sound of the first violins. And he just keeps developing that idea. But then ultimately he brings us back. Brings home that first movement. So he brings back recapitulation, is what we would call that, when the opening theme comes back and we actually hear it again to finish the piece. And then again, he shows off the virtuosity through scales and arpeggios, and yet brings it down to a delicate finish. So then we come into the second movement, the Andante, and this is really in the style of an Italian song. If you think of it, it really is a duet between the violins singing together. And so it just starts nice and easy. Continues on there. The voices sing in octave, they sing in harmony. Building up. And he continues through the first section, developing that idea. Interesting that in the second section of the Andante, all these are binary form, two parts that are repeated. So you have the opening section, happens twice, the next section happens twice. Binary form. So he starts in the idea of the opening. How do you link a section together? You take a theme and you utilize it throughout the work. It helps produce continuity, a sense that these three things work together. And so he starts similar to the opening movement. He's changed the rhythm, but it's still the same before he started. And then, you know, here. material from the Andante section as well. Beautiful. There's also duets that he uses between the second violin and the viola. It's almost a sharing of the solo material, which makes it even more interesting to hear that lower, deeper color, the viola, come into play, adding to it. Finally, at the end of the movement, kind of whimsical. He's not done. A little surprise ending. And he just holds it and resolves it. That takes us into the closing movement of the divertimento. It's a presto, and it totally fits, the name given to it. It's just light, it's playful. It starts with just 3 staccato chords that happen. And then again, to produce continuity, he takes us back to the opening theme, but again, has adapted the rhythm slightly, but it's clear. He goes off to develop that as well. But then, hearkening back to the previous movement again, he incorporates these staccato scales between the first violin and the second violin. It's almost just this playful, we're just playing and we're enjoying together. So then the second half of the section, composers often write fugal sections to show they're deft as a composer. And so he does, for the second half, again, binary form, he goes to offer a short contrapuntal theme. So it's a theme that's given and then it's answered by the voice part. So you'll hear the second violin. The first violin answers. But of course it's different. The the cellos. And of course you can't leave out the violas. And so that all comes together just into a great dance for just a moment. And then interestingly enough, he leaves you hanging. Takes you somewhere else for a moment, and he takes you one more spot. And then just a moment with the violas to remind us what we were doing. And then he brings us right back to the beginning. And then brings us through to the ending of the work. Very exciting, very vibrant. If you don't feel good after hearing it, we'll talk. But it's just an incredible piece of music, and it'll be a great way to open up the program. So that moves us then into what's the anchor work for the concert. It's a setting, it's a ballet setting, ultimately. And there's a lot of background on this I want to share with you, because the context in which this is written is really important to hear that story. So let's start with the basics of the arranger. It's based on the opera Carmen by Georges Bizet, but the Russian composer, Rodion Shchedrin, he's born in 1932, graduated from the Mozart Conservatory in 1955, where subsequently he also taught composition at that conservatory in the 1960s, which was when this work was composed. Now, one of Shchedrin's major roles was advocating the Russian government to loosen censorship. At that time, composers like Mahler, the Impressionists, Debussy, Ravel were not permitted to be played. And so he was kind of navigating this fine line for reforms, but he did it in such a way that he never actually got censored or silenced by the Communist Party. Now, in 1973, he becomes the chairman of the Composers Union of the Russian Federation. And interesting enough, he's following Dmitri Shostakovich, very famous orchestral composer. And Shchedrin served in that role from 1973 until 1990. And ultimately, while there, he was active in the political movements that led to President Boris Yeltsin and Russia's restructuring of its relationships. And that loosening ultimately enabled him to become more active in Western Europe. And at that point, he began dividing his time between Moscow and Munich. Now, if you look at his compositional style, it's wide-ranging. You hear folk influences, you hear liturgical music, Russian Orthodox, you hear experimental modernisms. In 20th century music, we always talk about the isms. So you have modernism, you have neo-romanticism. I mean, the list goes on. Impressionism, expressionism, serialism. 20th century, didn't know what to call it. It wasn't as clean as Baroque or classical, so we just gave it an ism and left it at that. So a neo-romantic, also experimenting with postmodern recontextualization. But at different points, he was also writing for different mediums. So he wrote 7 operas as well. Now, ballet was of a great appeal to him. He was actually married to the great Russian ballerina Maya Plisetska until she passed away in 2015 at the age of 89. So I want to deviate for a minute as her story is central to the creation of this suite. Now, from the very beginning, Plisetska was a very different kind of ballerina. She quickly became a soloist after graduation. Now, she had really bright red hair and striking looks, and so she was this glamorous figure both on and off the stage. The Oxford Dictionary of Dance commented that she was a remarkably fluid dancer, but also a very powerful one. Another quote about her: the robust theatricality and passion she brought to her roles made her an ideal Soviet ballerina. And her interpretation of The Dying Swan, a short showcase piece made famous by Anna Pavlova, became her calling card. Now, Plisetska was known for the height of her jumps, her extremely flexible back, the technical strength of her dancing, and her charisma. She also excelled both in adagio and allegro, slow and fast, which is very unusual in dancers. Now, she was born in 1925. She was Jewish during a time of suppression. She had family members who were executed, and amidst this emerges this defiant personality. And yet she was not allowed to tour outside of the country for decades. Now, the Soviet Union used the artistry of such dancers to project its achievements during the Cold War period with the United States. Historian Christina Ezrahai notes, in a quest for cultural legitimacy, the Soviet ballet was shown off to foreign leaders and nations. Plisetska recalls that foreigners were all taken to the ballet, and almost always Swan Lake was performed. And Khrushchev was always with the high guests in the lodge, which include Mao Zedong and Stalin. Now, returning to historians Christina Ezrahai's words, the intrinsic paranoia of the Soviet regime made it ban Plisetska, one of the most celebrated dancers, from the Bolshoi Ballet's first major international tour, as she was considered politically suspect and was non-exportable. In 1948, the Zhdanov Doctrine took effect, and with her family history and being Jewish, she became a natural target, publicly humiliated and excoriated for not attending political meetings. So as a result, dancing roles were continually denied her, and for 16 years, she could only tour within the Soviet bloc. Ballet scholar Jennifer Homan says, she became a provincial artist, consigned to grimy, unrewarding bus tours exclusively for local consumption. But in 1958, Plisetskova received the title of the People's Artist of the USSR. And that same year, she married the arranger, Rodion Shchedrin, whose subsequent fame she shared. And wanting to dance internationally, she rebelled and defied Soviet expectations. So on one occasion, to gain the attention and respect from some of the country's leaders, she gave one of the most powerful performances of her career in Swan Lake for a 1956 concert in Moscow. Going back to ballet scholar Jennifer Homans, she describes that extraordinary performance for us. Homans writes, "We can feel the steely contempt and defiance taking hold of her dancing. When the curtain came down on the first act, the crowd exploded. KGB toughs muffled the audience applauding hands and dragged people out of the theater kicking and screaming and scratching. By the end of the evening, the government thugs had retreated, unable or unwilling to contain the public enthusiasm. Plisetskova had won." So in 1959, the travel ban is now lifted from her, and she begins touring the world at the Bolshoi Ballet. Bolshoi Ballet, Russian, the Great Ballet. And this is the leading ballet company of Russia, Soviet Union. And it's famous for its elaborately staged productions of the classics and children's ballets that preserve the traditions of 19th century classical dance. So traditionalist, classicist. She receives rave reviews, and despite the communist fears, she does not defect. So now we come back to this Carmen suite. The idea for this work originated with Plisetskova, Shchedrin's wife. In 1966, she asked the choreographer, Alberto Alonso, who was touring Moscow at that time with the Cuban ballet, to compose a ballet on the story of Carmen. So Alonso develops a libretto and works with the Cuban ballet on the choreography, and then returns to Moscow to teach her the work. Husband Shchedrin is watching these initial rehearsals, and she was struggling to find someone who would take on the project to actually produce the music. And so he agrees that he will write the music for the ballet. Now, the problem for Shchedrin was originally it was going to be an original score, but with the storyline and the fame of Bizet's Carmen, he could not hear the famous themes that came from that opera. And so ultimately, he decided that he would take the music from Bizet's Carmen and arrange it. And he decided on an unusual sound. He decided he would go with strings and percussion. And part of this was, how do I depart so that this becomes an imitation of the opera, but in his words, a creative meeting of the minds, where he takes Bizet's melodies and reclothes them in a variety of fresh instrumental colors, set to new rhythms, and frankly, phrased with a good deal of some sly wit. Cheeky is actually a good descriptor for some of the movements in here. Now, two factors played into this decision about strings and percussion. In an interview with the BBC Music Magazine, he stated that it was a way to be as totally far as possible from Bizet's scoring for the opera. He wanted an ensemble without brass and woodwind, and it gave him many more possibilities for timbral variety. The second was a practical one, which was the high level of string and percussion players that were presently available in the Bolshoi Ballet's orchestra. So in 1967, she premieres this work as Carmen, and its themes were reworked into a modernist, almost abstract narrative. Dancer Olympia Dowd, who performed alongside her, writes that Plisetskova's dramatic portrayal of Carmen, which she named was her particular favorite role, made her a legend, and it actually became a landmark in the Bolshoi's repertoire. Now, it wasn't an immediate success. After the first performance, it actually got banned, and it was replaced initially by, pick a classical piece, a ballet. the Nutcracker. But ultimately, the story behind that, let's give that to you first. Her portrayal of Carmen, which shook up the censorship, was uncertain how to deal with her Latin sensuality. And she was also aware that the dance style being introduced was radical and new. And it was said that every gesture, every look, every movement had meaning, and it was different from all the other ballets. And yet the Soviet Union was not ready for this sort of choreography. And in her words, it was war. They accused her of betraying classical dance. Dance Magazine had this commentary about the premiere. When Carmen's Suite premiered, Soviet authorities deemed it as a scandalous travesty. Alonso's erotically charged, expressionistic choreography, incorporating elements of Spanish and Cuban dance, pushed the classical vocabulary to physical extremes. Another critique of it, Alora Haynes, she is a chair of fine arts at Santa Fe College, explains the ballet's story of personal defiance and individual freedom was inherently unsettling for Kremlin officials. So let's talk about this music. In many ways, it's a guilty pleasure in this score. As I said earlier, it's string orchestra and 5 percussionists. What do you need 5 percussionists for? Well, let me give you a list. We have marimba, vibraphone, castanets, cowbells, bongos, bells, chimes, snare drum, guiro. So when you put the wooden stick across, is the effect. Tambourine, wood blocks, claves, triangle, maracas, bass drum, cymbals, triangle again, timpani, tam-tam, tom-tom, Charleston. What's a tam-tam? It's an orchestral name for a gong. There's actually 2 of them in this performance of differing sizes. And then a fun trivia question for you. What is a Charleston? Give up? It's an early form of a hi-hat what drummers use, where you have 2 cymbals mounted on a stand, which can either be played while they're pressed together, or it can open and close as well while being struck. Now in this reduction, we basically focus on principal roles. So you have Carmen, a gypsy woman. You have Don Jose, who's a corporal. You have Escamillo, who's a bullfighter, a toreador. Zuniga, who is a captain related to the forces that Don Jose is the corporal of. Then you actually have, interestingly enough, you have a character called Fate. This is one who plays into what ultimately transpires in this one-act ballet. And then there's also a magistrate, and the company itself is present. Now, the story takes place in Seville, Spain, and the surrounding hills. The time period of the story would be approximately 1820. Now, choreographer Alonso's scenario centers on Carmen, Don Jose, and then the bullfighter Escamillo. Now, Carmen is a passionate, free-spirited gypsy woman in extreme contrast to the temperamental and fickle Don Jose. Now, Fate will appear as a ballerina dressed in black and a representation of Carmen's alter ego, who at one point tells Carmen's fortune with a deck of cards. Now, a fight leads to Carmen's arrest by Zuniga, and in jail, she seduces Don Jose and convinces him to release her from prison. And subsequently, because of Carmen's free-spirited gypsy ways, she finds herself caught in a love triangle as Don Jose falls in love, and yet she is drawn towards the popular, famous bullfighter, Escamillo. So the original stage setting was, there's actually a YouTube video of this, which was later produced as a feature film. But the original setting of the stage was actually a mock bull ring, which is understood to symbolize life. And yet, interesting, it's sort of dark in the sense that it's uniting a bullfight, and yet what ultimately becomes Carmen's destiny. And so just a very dramatic picture for this ballet. And then there are masked spectators sitting around the ring, and And there's also actually a uniformed judge who was representing a society's disapproval for Carmen's unconventional behavior, as well as that of her lovers. And fate ultimately reappears in the final act, playing the role of a bull. And the three main characters, Carmen, Don Jose, Escondido, meet in this arena. And Carmen ends up dancing between the two men until ultimately she is stabbed and dies. And as she dies, she reveals that Don Jose was the assassin. So let's walk through this score for a minute and see what all's here. So it opens at the very beginning, with that cheeky sense where he just gives chords to the lower strings. And then in the chimes, you hear a very famous theme, but only part of it. More tension. Just kind of alluding to it. And then you watch the strings as they strike their strings with the wood of the bow. Interesting effect. And it continues in this manner where you suddenly realize you're on this journey going somewhere. And then it builds up. And launches into the opening dance. And it introduces a great Latin-inspired theme. Very exciting, all kinds of color, percussion happening throughout as we launch into the story. We then move into what's called an intermezzo, kind of an in-between moment. The mallets get the theme. So we start building the drama as we move into the ultimate capture. And of course, we were talking about Don Jose. And so Don Jose very fittingly gets a rather heavy theme. You'll hear in the marimba and vibraphone. And the theme appears in the strings. More tension. Slight resolution, but not quite yet, because we have a long way to go. And it continues. So then we have the changing of the guard that happens. And again, kind of I love this thing. You'll just hear it. Has a charm to it, and yet very serious as to what is about to transpire. And then we get introduced to Carmen, of course, which you know what this brings. introduces herself. All eyes are on her. So then we move into a more dramatic scene. It's where the Charleston, the hi-hat, makes an introduction. And again, this shows, that Cuban, that Latina influence, where the string starts with pizzicatos. What's going to happen? And then ultimately in the strings, you get this. It's movie music almost. And again, it just takes off. Exciting. Which brings us into bullfighting as well. Yes. And ultimately, the courtship, the seduction of Don Jose to secure release from prison. But not quite. Always slightly teasing. So it's almost foreshadowing what is yet to come, that this isn't going to work out. And it just keeps happening throughout the piece. And so that courtship continues, that tango. So we jump further ahead. There's a bolero, there's very vibrant dance that happens, and now we get into our introduction to the matador. And this is a very dramatic scene, and this is where Carmen becomes smitten with him. And so you get this introduction. We're at the bull ring, getting ready to go. Continues, this strong, aggressive dance, which then leads us to the most famous theme probably from this. Now, part of the not wanting to be an imitator, as it continues into this next section, sort of an insider joke for you, is he continues on with the same accompaniment, but he omits the theme. And so literally all you're going to hear for a minute is this. Puts a little counter theme in. To it. So when you listen to it, we left it out on purpose because that's what we were told to do. And then we come back to the Matador theme. And continues in his show. We continue on. The tango happens back and forth between the two of them. And finally, Carmen comes into play. This hypnotizing theme, it just keeps happening in the viola. Then above, first violins. And this continues as the duet now begins, as she dances with the matador, the one whom she is now wanting to seduce. Of course, Don Jose is not happy about this and is jealous because he has fallen in love. And so some interesting text painting as we move into the next section. You'll hear on the chimes almost like alarm bells going with, with the upper string players as well, doing a tremolo where you just hear, and then the Don Jose theme from earlier comes back, just as ominous as before. But again, where is it going? And so it continues to build as his jealousy, his rage continues to build up. And yet he goes through the vacillation of emotions where he walks away for a minute, dejected. And there's a lament that's played for him. It just... expressive melody, but again, he continues to show the vacillating emotions where later on the drama's building up again. It's almost his moment of hope. Can I win her heart? And it's just this outpouring of emotion, an incredible wash of sound as he's trying to figure out, can I win her back? And yet at the very end, we're not sure. Just hangs for a moment. Ominous chord, changes again, and then you hear the crunch, but the crunch is still in there. Does it resolve? Moment of hope. But of course you have to have drama, and so the fortune teller, right as we end that ominous note as we go up a half step, something's happening. The drama builds. The fortune teller comes in and presents the cards to Carmen. What will your fate be? Ominous notes. Individually, you might say, what's ominous about that? If I sustain it, more tension, dissonance on dissonance. What's going to happen next? So now, almost a heartbeat pumping. Cello gets this great line. And it just continues to go through, considering what will the fate be in this situation. And tension builds throughout the orchestra as we come through towards the finale. Ultimately, what is going to happen as we come down. We keep coming back to this idea. And then the percussion comes back in, and we start getting another famous theme. Introduced voice by voice, building bottom up from the cello, changing keys, intentionally creating dissonance, knowing that something's going to happen, but we don't know what yet. Has the fate been decided? A moment of bright spot. Finally get the first violin in. Building tension into harmony. Wherever we go to resolve, we still haven't resolved. It's all underneath here. And then suddenly in the marimba comes in this. I almost feel like I'm back at Knoebels on the merry-go-round. I mean, it has that quality where it's like, where is this coming from in contrast to the drama that's just come before it? And yet there's this battle then between the percussion and yet this. You know, it's almost like a moment of escapism in this scene, but then the orchestra comes back with these ominous notes. But not to be convinced yet, they go off again. And so you hear these scenes go back and forth, you know. Does fate always win? Do we have another path? There's so many questions you can, you know, put into that based on how you want to interpret it. So ultimately we have the matador and fate wrestling, they're in the ring, what's going to happen? So we come back to capturing the material that was used earlier on in the ballet. And so finally then we come to the dramatic moment where Don Jose just cannot take it anymore as he realizes that Carmen has chosen to be with the matador. And so we have this build-up of tension. Again, we're back in that ominous theme where we know something's going to happen with Don Jose. And ultimately, it's that moment where he takes her life. And so we get into this, that fate theme, and yet that Don Jose crunch went earlier on in his music. Really dissonant again. Almost like a demon's taking over. Suddenly just the lowest instrument in the orchestra, the contrabass. A lament over what has just happened. And as she is fading away, almost that's the strings asking, is this really happening? And then we're back where we started. Strings again striking as the beginning with the bow and the string. An incredible, striking piece of music. I hope you enjoy the storytelling that's presented in it. And then I wanted to close the program with something that can be inspiring, uplifting, hopeful, for all the obvious reasons. I mean, I'm sitting in here on election night. When I walked in this afternoon, our church is used as a polling place, and we're all aware of what we're all feeling, regardless of what we think or believe, and what's happening currently. And so to me, I wanted to put something out there that could just sing on in our hearts. And so I decided to program, the iconic Adagio for Strings by Samuel Barber. Now, a little bit about Samuel Barber. Pretty much everyone seems to know Adagio for Strings. They've heard it. We'll get to that in a moment. You may not know who Samuel Barber was. Who was this person, and where did he come from in his music, etc. Samuel Barber was actually born in nearby Westchester, Pennsylvania, in 1910. And as a child, he took piano and cello lessons. And he also was encouraged by an aunt and an uncle. She was a singer, he was a composer, and so they encouraged his musical endeavors. Now, as a teenager, he was actually the organist at Westminster Presbyterian Church, which now is located on 202, but originally was actually in town in Westchester at that time. And he attended Westchester High School, where he graduated in 1926. Now note his age, he was only 16 years old. Now concurrently, backing up 2 years, at the age of 14, so 1924, he actually began his academic music study as a fortunate member of the first class at the newly formed Curtis Institute of Music in Philadelphia. And he actually spent 8 years at Curtis. And initially he was studying piano and composition, but later on added singing. And he was a baritone, he was interested in developing his voice. He even considered a singing career, he was giving concerts, and he even recorded with NBC Radio in the 1930s. And it's here where he met Toscanini, and he showed him his compositions. And 3 years later, Toscanini would record Barber's, it's called the First Essay for Orchestra, and then the Adagio for Strings. And the Adagio actually is the middle movement, a three-movement work for string quartet in B minor, but the Adagio has often stood alone. And what's unique about this piece for me is it just starts softly and on a single note. So we have no idea as a listener, what's the key? Like, where are we going? Because there's no tempo, there's no harmony. It's just this one note that comes in, very plaintive. And it's in the first violins. And then finally, the voices come in underneath it, setting a tonality. Again, striking. When we hear that chord, we know, I feel like we know exactly what that is. And he starts to move. And then the melody starts to go. And it's uneasy, it's shifting. You hear these suspensions as the melody's beginning to move up in this stepwise motion. It's almost this hesitant climbing of stairs. Now, it's about 8 minutes long until the piece is over. Harmonically, it's really unresolved as, it just continues in motion, but it doesn't actually come to a cadence that tells us the key until you're 19 measures into the piece, which at the tempo that this goes, I don't know the exact timing, but we'll call it 2 minutes. And yet, despite all this, the thing I love about it is, first you have this kind of sigh effect, where he's there, and suddenly it's like, well, this may feel heavy, but there's a confidence that comes, and it starts to build. So it gives a sense of hope, this sense of direction, this sense, I'm scared, but I'm willing to take that climb. Another way to think about it is a sense of just abiding love. And I like that. I like that notion of that. It's part of what inspired me to program this piece, especially right now where, again, tensions are high. You know, we're all striving to get through a pandemic and deal with the political conflict and all the unrest in community. And so this notion of abiding love amongst people is part of what I was thinking about. It's this prayer for hope, this prayer for love, this prayer for restoration, you know, as we continue to navigate these times together. Now, in the history of this piece, it's kind of a shapeshifter. It's been used in film, television. I actually came across DJ Tiesto's arrangement of this, so a techno arrangement, where he pumps up this heavy techno rhythm beat and drives the bass. And I think there's 100 million views of that arrangement on YouTube. And he arranged it, I should say, in 2003. And it's still on his set list today, and audiences still expect him to play it. His comment is, the reaction is phenomenal. When I play the Adagio and I hear the bass line and the high sounds, people start screaming. And then at the first break of the track, people scream again. The reactions are the same all around the world. Now, when I first heard about DJ Tiesto's arrangement, I'm aware of this one. I'm aware of the strings. Can we be talking about the same piece? And yet at the same time, regardless of the idiom, a violinist and a Curtis faculty member says about the piece, you have to be a rock in the middle of nowhere not to have your gut wrenched out by this music. And another comment, there are tremendous suspensions over the bar line, places where Barber creates this greater tension by changing harmonies, but staggered in such a way that the dissonances form and then resolve. The piece is all about tension. Now, this piece was broadcast over the radio in 1945 at the announcement of the death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And so it became associated with state and celebrity funerals. It's also appeared in a litany of films like A Very Natural Thing, Platoon, The Elephant Man, and Lorenz's Oil. And of course, in great 20th century fashion, it gets featured on television on two iconic shows, despite what you might think of them, The Simpsons and South Park. It's also been sampled, synthesized. It's been arranged for clarinet, choir, electric guitar, marimbas, brass band. I thought this was great. It appears as a track on Body Burn, 18 classics to get yourself in shape. I kind of want to see if I can find that and just see how it appears. But the director of Elephant Man, 1980 film, comment says about the Adagio, it's pure magic. It's deeply spiritual and simply beautiful. And so let me just give you this opening part, just so you hear a little bit of it, and I'll play you to the first resolution. So I invite you just to enjoy. first cadence in the key. And those lines continue to intertwine between the various voice parts. And finally, it builds up towards the end, and everything just keeps moving higher. The bass drops out for a moment, the shimmer of the strings. You'll see these long bows, they're heavy vibrating on it as they come up into the top. They're up in here in the upper registers. And then suddenly the weight of the whole orchestra adds below. And the question is, how does it resolve? Does it resolve? Not where we thought. And there's a moment of contemplation and this tender entrance. Still dissonant, but yet hope. There is resolution. Less dissonance, but there's still some there. And yet still resolution. Not always on a path where we know where it's going to go next, like this chord. And yet beautiful, peaceful. And yet then we're reminded again of where we started. The journey always continues. But this time it's more familiar because we've been down this path. We launch higher than before. Reaching. We hear it one more time. We're able to settle sooner. Suspension. And it just hangs. For a moment, time can stop. And hopefully we know peace. And hopefully we know abiding love. I want to thank you for joining me for tonight's Tuesday with Tim. Next Tuesday, we will feature the quartet performing great choral anthems. This is a rescheduling from last week's program. But this Saturday, November 7th, at 7:30 p.m., is the orchestra concert. And I'll hope you will join all of us live for that performance. Part of the work we've been doing here is to prepare for a live performance so we can feel community, so we can feel togetherness, so we can share and experience together. And so we'll actually, when this gets posted to YouTube, we will post a link to the concert there. Those engaged in the music ministry, as well as the audience of the Wayne Oratorio Society, will also receive links for that performance so that you can also share. And I encourage you to share that via email and invite other people to be part of this concert as we look to bring the performing arts back into the public realm one step at a time. I also just want to share with you 2 additional upcoming concerts here at Wayne. In 2 Tuesdays, November 17th, we'll be presenting the first Music Transforms concert. Music Transforms is we'll call it our chamber music series here at the church, but it also benefits music education in Southwest Philadelphia and is continuing to do so during the semester while children are at home. And then finally, in honor of the Christmas season, for me, Christmas at Wayne is just a special time, and not knowing where these coming weeks will lead us. I couldn't imagine going through a Christmas season without some type of music or concert offering. And so the Wayne Oratorio Society Orchestra will again present a concert the first Saturday in December. That's December 5th at 7:30 p.m. It'll be a mixture of program from Baroque Christmas music to English to just some Christmas carols that hopefully bring some joy into that season as well. And so I want to thank you again for joining me tonight, and God bless you. Take care.